Well, hello and welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world, either here in the UK, over there in Canada, or anywhere else. Thank you so much for joining us for this incredible and fascinating event. Today, we're going to be talking about the strength of the human spirit. My name is Dave Coplin, and I'm here to be the master of ceremonies for today's event. I'm a lifelong technologist. I've spent the majority of my life trying to understand what it means to be human in the context of our relationship with technology. And one of the things that's been particularly interesting over the last 6 months as we've endured the pandemic is how important that relationship with technology has become, but also how difficult that relationship can sometimes be. And I think we see that around us in so many different ways, in so many different aspects of our lives. The part of the problem of the pandemic has been how divisive it's been, how it has a disproportionate effect on the poor versus the rich, the disconnected versus the connected. And as we move into winter, I think this is the perfect time for us to all come together as a community, and in this sense, a global community, to discuss the kind of society that we want to be in, the kind of society that we'd like to create. And as we go in through the next few months and the next phase of this pandemic, where do we want to be? How do we want to emerge from this? And how can we emerge from it in a much brighter, a more powerful and stronger position that is reflective for our entire community? The purpose for this discussion today is obviously to hear and be inspired by our special guest, Terry Waite, but it's also for us to drive a multi-generational conversation so we can talk amongst ourselves and try to find out the most effective way for us to move forward. And with that, with no further ado, I'd like to introduce you to the sponsor of today's event. Let me bring in Dan Shaw. Dan, thanks for joining us.
Welcome to Terry Waite, The Strength of the Human Spirit, COVID-19, Isolation, Loneliness, and Societal Change. My name is Dan Shaw, and I'm a faculty member at the Rose School of Business at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. I've been working closely with our organizing committee, David Stewie, Laurie Turnbull, Judy McDonald, Wendy Terrace-Kloss, Robert Patzelt, Jan Booley, Chris Stover, Krista Cullymore, and Heather Frozell, David Coplin, and Fred Warren. I want to thank Segelberg Trust Warren Lecture Series, the School of Social Work at Dalhousie University, and the faculty management of the Dalhousie University for their support and sponsorship of this lecture. My grandfather, Lloyd Shaw, was a Nova Scotian industrialist, social activist, and humanitarian. The Lloyd Shaw Lecture Series was created by my father, Robbie, and my aunt, Alexa McDonough, to acknowledge Lloyd's dedication to the province of Nova Scotia. The goal of the Lloyd Shaw Lecture in Public Affairs is to provide regular opportunity to examine and contribute to the debate on important public issues, and to do so in a manner that sheds light on the subject from the vantage point of public interest. The lecture seeks to reinforce the idea of the university as an institution that can bring people from different walks of life together in an educational setting where they can discuss, learn, and contribute in a multi-partisan manner. Previous Shaw lectures include former Canadian Ambassador to the UN, Mr. Stephen Lewis, former Assistant Secretary General for Peace Building at the UN, Ms. Carol McCaskey, and Yale University Professor Marie C. Gentil. I would like to recognize my aunt Alexa McDonough and my father Robbie, who are in the audience and who created this endowed lecture. So now for an introduction to Terry. Terry is a world-renowned humanitarian and author. Terry has been a leading voice in helping people understand more about isolation, loneliness, and how societies adapt and change. After enduring nearly 5 years of solitary confinement, Terry's experience and observations about the power of solitude in our lives is more relevant than ever as we contemplate the future in a new world. Like Sir David Attenborough's warning for life on our planet, Terry has stark warnings for the long-term impact of coronavirus on our humanity, but also sees significant opportunities of hope for how this new position of shared empathy may provide growth and strength for our communities that, had it not been for the extremity of the pandemic, may have laid dormant, obscured forever by the normality of our busy lives. Terry is joining live stream from the UK. He will speak for about 30 minutes, followed by time for questions. The lecture will be followed at 1 p.m. by online breakout sessions to explore personal challenges and opportunities raised by COVID-19, that might provide insight and direction for how we might all come together to create discussion and debate to help shape and inform public policy. We are hoping to continue this conversation through a podcast and further events, so stay tuned. We're excited to have Terry share his new perspective and to start a new conversation of hope and compassion. So welcome to Terry.
Well, hello everybody, and I'm speaking to you this afternoon from my home in Suffolk, which is in the east of England, and I'm speaking from my kitchen. This is a very old house. You may see the beams in the background. It was built in about 1400, so it's been standing for a long, long time, long before modern technology hit us. What I'd like to do today is speak about my own experience of spending almost 5 years in complete solitary confinement. They were years of great, considerable deprivation, and it's an extreme situation, of course. It's a situation that I don't think many people who are listening to this will necessarily have to experience, although everyone will experience times of loneliness and isolation at some point during their lives. But I speak from an extreme situation because I think it's from extreme situations that you can take understandings that are applicable to so-called normal life. And in a sense, in the last months, we've been, most of us, if not all of us, living rather an unusual form of life. And still, life goes on, and we have to learn how to cope with it, how to deal with it, and how to deal with changed circumstances, just as I had to learn that in my 5 years of solitary confinement. So what I'm going to do, the way I'm going to proceed, is first of all, speak a bit about my own experience as a negotiator working for the release of people who've been illegally detained around the world, and speak a little bit about how I approach that, and then go on from that to speak about an event that went wrong and where I was captured and put into solitary confinement, and then concentrate on that period of time, those 5 years. How did one cope with that? What happened in those 5 years? And what happened at the end of that when I came out? That's the format I'll take today. My own experience of negotiating for the release of innocent people goes back a long, long time. Some of you may remember or may have heard of the name of Amin, General Amin. He styled himself the last king of Scotland. He was, in fact, a dictator, and he took over from President Obote in Uganda when he engineered a coup there in the late 60s. I was working in Uganda at the time and witnessed the coup and the after effects of it. And it was a terrible time. For the first time in my life, I saw people murdered before my eyes, and I saw the devastating effects of what happens when law and order breaks down. When law and order breaks down, very frequently all hell breaks loose, and that happened in Uganda. Many of my colleagues were taken and put into some of the camps, concentration camps I suppose they were, which were scattered in and around Kampala. Many of them were killed, murdered. And I used to do my best to try and obtain the release of these people, which meant that I had negotiations directly with Amin himself. And I got some released, but not many. From Beirut, from that situation in Uganda, I moved after a number of years, lived in Rome, and worked all over the world, working in pretty well every trouble spot of the world in various capacities. And then I moved back to the UK with my family and became actively involved in negotiating for the release of hostages. First in Iran at the time of the Iranian Revolution, when I visited Iran. Later on in Libya, when I met face to face with Gaddafi and negotiated the release of people there. And latterly in Beirut, where I was able to obtain the release of some people, but unfortunately things went wrong, and I'll tell you about that in a moment, and I was captured. And my style of negotiating has been a style that is highly dangerous and does not work in every situation. There are two types of hostage taking, really, and they're divided for the sake of clarity only. On the one hand, there's hostage taking, which is described as political hostage taking, where hostages are taken and they're taken because the people who've taken them want to gain some political advantage and they use them as bargaining counters. That's political hostage taking. There's another type of hostage taking which goes under the heading of criminal hostage taking, but in fact it is hostage taking for money. Ransom is demanded, and that's been more common in recent years. The Somali events were one very good example of hostage taking, criminal hostage taking for money, for ransom. Now, all forms of hostage taking where the innocent are taken, of course, are criminal acts in themselves, but they're divided between political and criminal, so that because the way in which you would negotiate in those situations is different. If you're dealing with a political case, you negotiate in one way. If it's a criminal case for ransom, you would negotiate in another way. The way I dealt with the political cases, and all my experience basically has been with political cases, is first of all, try and seek a face-to-face meeting with the hostage takers themselves. Now that is extremely difficult and quite dangerous. It may take a long time to get that, if you get it at all. And of course it's dangerous because if you're meeting face to face, you're exposing yourself to great risk. You are dealing with people who are often very volatile and who may easily capture you or kill you. And you have to be prepared to take that risk. No one makes you do that job. And let me emphasize this point. If things go wrong, you don't blame other people. You take your own responsibility for it because nobody forced you into that position. If you can get a face-to-face meeting, then the next step is to try and build a relationship of trust between yourself and the individual or individuals with whom you're talking. Now that can be difficult, again, because very frequently you're dealing with people and working with people from a different background, a different culture, a different religion, and somehow you have to have that ability to cross those boundaries and establish a human face-to-face relationship. It can be done, and it's been done. People have always said to me, you will never, for example, be able to talk with Revolutionary Guards in Iran. They were quite wrong. It was possible to talk with them. It was possible even to form friendships with them and to visit their homes and have a meal with their families. People said you will never be able to talk with Gaddafi. He's crazy. It was possible to talk with Gaddafi, and it was possible both in Iran and in Libya to obtain the release of people who've been illegally and wrongly detained. So, building trust. The next issue to face is try and get to the root question. Why is it you're behaving as you're behaving? What is it you're asking for? Remember, this is dealing with political cases. If you can get to the root issue, then you can begin to unravel the situation, hopefully. And here, in getting to that root issue, it's very important that you hear that from the people who've done the capturing. You can't go on just rumor or press report or what is said there. You have to go to hear it from the person themselves. And so those are the steps. If you can get that far, as has been possible in many instances in my experience to get that far, then you can begin to try and find a way of unraveling the situation. And in many instances, that is possible. It isn't possible in every case, but it's possible in many instances. And it requires patience and it requires time. And I think sometimes we have been, in many international situations, we've been too quick to go to violence or go to warfare or attack people, rather than spend the time trying to understand, trying to negotiate, trying to get to the root of the issue and trying to unravel it. That takes time, and it takes patience, and it takes a certain skill. When it comes to Beirut, a number of years ago, and Beirut, of course, I'm still in touch with Beirut, still in touch with that country, with the people there. And it's a small country which has had tremendous difficulties in its history. It's a place where you have different religions, where you have different ethnic groups, where you have a complex mix of people. And the fact is, it's always in the past been under the shadow of Syria, who has sought to control it. And many outside powers have sought to control that country. It's had a very, very difficult history. Hostages, at the time I was involved, people were taken hostage there from different parts of the world, from Europe, from America, or from Germany, from right across Europe. People were taken hostage, and no one really knew why they had been taken. What was the purpose for their taking of hostages? People came to me, families came to me of hostages and said, look, we're not getting any understanding of what's happening. We're not getting any help. Can you help us? Can you really see what can be done? And I didn't want to be involved in Beirut, to be honest. I knew how politically complex it was, and I knew that the situation was going to go on for a long, long time. And my own feeling has been this, that if you take up a case on behalf of relatives who are finding life extremely tough and difficult, and you take it up, you are obliged to stay with it until such time as your own involvement becomes dangerous for the hostages themselves. It's no good taking it up and then saying, oh, it's getting too tough, I'm going to leave now. You're obliged to stay with it. At least that's what I felt. And I knew this was going to be a long and politically complicated case, and I just had other things to do and didn't feel like engaging in another case. Well, relatives kept coming to me. They came to me from America, they came to me from the UK, and eventually I said, all right, I'll have a go. Now, the thing is, how do you establish contact? I gave you those steps. How do you establish contact? Unknown hostage takers in Beirut. I don't know Beirut. I'm not familiar with it. I've been there, but I'm not familiar with it. How do you make that first contact with people? Well, I puzzled about that, and I thought the way to do it was to take a high public profile, was to go to the media and say, through the media and through the Middle Eastern media in particular, that I was willing to go out there and willing to meet with hostage takers and talk about the situation. Well, I went on countless radio broadcasts, TV broadcasts, newspapers, and was accused, of course, at one time of grandstanding. You know, people said, oh, that fellow's just promoting himself. Not knowing that this was a deliberate strategy, trying to get some response. And it did get a response. And sometimes, you know, in these situations, you have to be prepared for the unusual. One day, a man by the name of Myron Belkind was the correspondent, the AP, Associated Press correspondent in London. And one of his men, that is Terry Anderson, who was the bureau chief in Beirut, was in captivity. So Myron had, and AP had, particular interest in that particular situation, apart from the news interest. Myron came into my office one day and he handed me a slip of paper. And on this paper, there were several names. And I looked at them, and they were the names of hostages who were being held in Beirut. And there was a simple message. It said, we've heard what you said, come out and talk with us. Words to that effect. Well, the first thing to do, I mean, where on earth did this note come from? It had been sent to the AP office in London, but where it originated, was it genuine? How do you check? I had to think hard about this. And so I decided that I would, in fact, get out there on the basis of this very slight evidence that there was some possibility of a meeting. It was years later that I found out how this note had come to the AP. What had happened was that the captors had heard my appeal. They had gone into the cell with a pre-written message where these men were kept, the hostages were kept. They'd asked them to sign it. They'd then got the paper, wrapped it round a stone, got in a car, travelled through Beirut, through the stone, into the doorway with the paper round it of Associated Press. The staff on duty picked it up, recognised its importance, transmitted it to London, to Myron Belkind. He brought it to my office. That's how it happened, but I didn't know that at the time. I only learned this years later when I met the hostages. And so on the basis of that, as I say, I went out there. I went to stay in the apartment of Terry Anderson, who had been the correspondent out there and who was believed to be in captivity. And I waited. I'd been told also to take a shortwave radio with me and tune into a certain frequency. And the kidnappers would contact me on that frequency. And AP set up the radio in the apartment. And I tuned in and listened day and night, and nothing happened. Then one evening, the phone rang. And I picked it up. And the voice on the other end said, "We're the people you want to see. Come and meet us." And they named a petrol station, a gas station nearby. Well, you know, you take risks, but there's no way in which I was going to just accept that on the basis of that one phone call. Anybody could have phoned. People were being taken off the streets left, right, and centre in Beirut at the time. So what one had to do was to try and think quickly. One of the things you have to do when you're in that situation is think quickly and think on your feet. How can I test? And then I came up with this idea that, first of all, I said to them, before I come and see you, would you phone me back with the nickname of the name of a girlfriend of Terry Anderson, knowing full well that that obscure bit of information could only be received by someone who actually had contact with Anderson or with one of the people who was holding him. And then I put the phone down. About an hour later, the phone rang again, and the voice at the other end said, "The name you want is Krista." That was the name. So then that switched. We arranged then not to meet at the gas station, but to meet at another location in Beirut, which was a doctor's consulting room, and to meet there in a couple of days' time. Doctor's consulting room, a good place to meet. People are in and out all the time and needn't necessarily be identified. And so I went to that appointment a couple of days later. Beirut, as I said, was in turmoil. The streets were full of armed people. There were rockets going off at night. I went at night. The AP driver took me to the end of the street, and then he dropped me, and then I walked alone up to the apartment. I got to the doctor's apartment. He took me through. He said, "You're going to have to be blindfolded for this meeting." I said, "Okay." That's a handicap, because when you're negotiating, of course, you really depend a lot, not just on verbal exchange, but on bodily exchange, or body signals, body language. Anyway, I had to accept that. I was blindfolded. He took me through to another room and sat me behind a desk. And then I heard the door open and people entered the room, and beneath the blindfold, I could see several sets of feet. So I said, before we begin, I said, "Will you take me to see the hostages?" They said, "No, it's too dangerous." I said, "Outside, I brought with me a Polaroid camera." I said, "Will you take that camera and bring me back pictures of people you're holding?" Obviously, one wanted proof of life. There's no good negotiating if people are not there, if they're dead or whatever. And they agreed to that, and I waited, and about an hour later, or 2 hours later, they came back and presented me with 4 pictures of 4 hostages standing with against a white background, all of them bearded, looking straight into the camera. And they were holding the copy of a paper, a newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, that I'd seen on the doctor's desk when I was blindfolded, and that I'd signed in the top right-hand corner and asked them to take pictures of the hostages holding that paper, because I wanted proof that those pictures had been taken that night. And so I was on to the right track. Then began a whole series of negotiations. That claim they said they had blood relatives who were being held in Kuwait on a variety of terrorist charges. They were being kept in appalling conditions, and they wanted better treatment for them. I said I couldn't intervene in due process of law, but what I could do was try and see that their conditions were humane. And I tried. 2 hostages were released at that stage. Both Americans, both clergymen actually, Ben Weir and Martin Jenko, a Presbyterian and a Roman Catholic priest. And it was said, whether it was true or not, I don't know, but it was said that they were released in order to encourage me to keep up my efforts. I got nowhere. I got absolutely nowhere. I couldn't make any progress into getting into Kuwait and to looking into this matter, and it seemed like a total failure. Then a surprising thing happened. A hostage was released by the name of David Jacobson, another American. And when the hostages were released, the Americans, that is, they were sent to a military base in Wiesbaden in Germany. And when Weir and Jenko were released, I went over there and met with them. Here there was the CIA and the others who were they went from medical debriefing, a political debriefing. I kept well clear of that and saw the hostages entirely separately to try and pick up what information I could. And Jacobson, when he was released, I went over there. David was convinced I'd obtained his relief, and I couldn't think of what had happened. And then it all became very clear. One afternoon I was waiting to go home, having seen David Jacobson, and someone came into the room and said, "Have you heard the news?" I said, "What news?" He said, "There's a story that hostages have been released, or Jacobson has been released, as a result of arms dealing." And at that point my stomach fell. I said, well, tell me more. They said the name of Colonel Oliver North is mentioned. And of course, this was beginning of something which you may read about at some point, the Iran-Contra affair. Iran-Contra was this. Iran was fighting the Iran-Iraq war. Iran also was giving support to Hezbollah in Lebanon and supplying them with weapons and what have you. Unknown to me, quite unknown to me, Colonel North went to Iran and said to Iran, if you will pressure your clients in Beirut to release hostages, we will supply you with weapons. Some weapons were supplied, one hostage was released, and that was that. Now, I knew nothing about that, and of course, if I'd known anything about it, I would have had absolutely nothing to do with arms exchange for hostages. I just don't believe in that. I came back to London with a heavy heart. I thought, what on earth to do now? I was advised to pull out completely, and I said, well, no, I must continue. I just can't pull out at this stage. I can't leave those hostages. Everybody said to go back, you'll be crazy. Well, I felt that I just couldn't leave it. I felt if I didn't go back, I would be always accused of being complicit with arms dealing, about which I'd have nothing to do. I had nothing to be afraid of in that respect. I'd go back and meet them face to face. And so I went back to Beirut. I went to the apartment. I went around for the week. I went to visit various people to try and pick up the threads of the negotiation. Nothing happened, and then one night again, after several days, the phone rang and said it was my contact. He said, are you coming to see us? I said, yes. Same place, he said, come and see us. Doctor's consulting room. I went back there. We sat down, and he said, this is a bad business. He said, in the past, we've not allowed you to see the hostages. We will now, because one is about to die. I said what anybody would say. I said, look, if I come and see him, you'll keep me. They said, no. I said, give me 24 hours to think about it. I said, okay. They went away. I took advice. You can guess the advice. 3 sets of advice. Don't touch it with a barge pole. Don't, you'll probably be all right, but we can't be sure. You will be all right because you've been given the promise. I was very dubious. But there comes a time in life when you really feel that you can't walk away from situations, whether it's right or wrong. I felt I'm going to go. I'm going to go and see them. I must. Something compelled me to do that. And so the next night I went back. As soon as I got to the doctor's apartment, my intuition said something's not right here. The telephone rang and the doctor picked up the phone. He said, I've got to leave you. He said, there's an emergency at the hospital. I said, can't you wait? He said, no, I must go now. And he left. And I remember taking my shoes off and walking up and down his apartment in my bare feet, thinking, should I stay? Should I go? And then I heard them come up, someone come into the room, and of course it was my contact. Quick pat down, that's all. Come with me. We went downstairs, got into a car, drove across Beirut. The car stopped. I was told to get out. I was blindfolded, put into another car with armed men in the back, armed men in the front, set off, blindfolded, came to what I assume was underground car park beneath an apartment block. I was told to get out and taken to a room, given a complete change of clothing, blindfolded all the time, and there I waited for about 5 days. I suppose this was a way of trying to shake off any tail. That's the hard part, this waiting, this not knowing. After 5 days, they came and said, right, we're going now. Again, I was taken downstairs into another vehicle. We drove across town. We came into, again, what I believe was an underground car park. They told me to jump out. Looking beneath the blindfold, I saw a trapdoor in the floor. I was told to jump down. I jumped down. I was pushed across the room, and the door closed behind me. And when I took the blindfold off, I was in a tiled cell. And I knew then the game was up. I was no longer a negotiator, I was a hostage. And I don't know, I felt it was a terrible little place. I mean, I could hardly stand up. I couldn't stand up straight in it. It was a tiled, completely tiled. My blood ran cold then because I realized these places are tiled because they're easier to clean up after people have been knocked around. And I wondered just what the future held. There were 3 or 4 cells down there. There were people in the other cells. To this day, I don't know who they were. We had to keep absolute silence. There was a very primitive shower, primitive toilet facilities, and that was it. My thoughts were, I was angry at first, very angry. I was angry with myself for taking such a risk, and certainly angry with my captors for deceiving me in that way. And when you're angry, you have to do something about it. My way of coping with that, and still showing that I still had a measure of freedom, was to refuse all food. I said, I'm not going to eat. For a week, I didn't eat for a week. I just drank water. At the end of the week, they said, well, okay, if you don't eat now, we shall make you. And by that time, my anger, I got control of it. I once wrote a poem about anger. It was this: anger is like a consuming fire, seeking all whom it may devour. Do not extinguish the flames totally, but calm yourself by the gentle glow of the embers. Meaning, of course, that it's a natural human emotion, we all experience it. But if it gets the better of you, it'll do you more harm than it does those against whom it's held. So I got control of that somehow. The first year was one of interrogation. And they believe that because North had been mentioned, and I'd met North, obviously, I'd met him in the past, I'd met all people who'd been associated with negotiating, they believed that I would understand what had happened in relationship between America and Iran, about which I knew nothing. The torture was experienced by beatings. I was beaten on the sole of the feet with cable. I was moved from underground to be in sometimes in a bombed out building. When I was in this bombed out building, there were metal shutters put in front of the window so no natural light came in. I was chained by the hands and feet to the wall for 23 hours and 50 minutes a day. I slept on the floor on a mattress. There were no books and papers for almost 5 years. No companionship. I never saw anybody. I mean, when someone came in the room with food, I had to pull a blindfold over my eyes. And so it was complete and utter isolation. And I was afraid that in that situation I was going to lose my reason. I'd heard of people who'd been kept in strict isolation, strict solitary confinement, and become crazy. And I realized that I had to do one thing more importantly than anything else. I had to keep my brain alive. I began to write in my head and began to compose in my head. I wrote poetry in my head. There's a book here, a book of poetry that I published later, which a lot of it was written in my head in those years. I also started to write about my life, and again, that was published at a later stage, a book called Taken on Trust. Keeping my brain alive, I had also to learn how to live one day at a time. Not to try and think too much about the future. It doesn't mean to say you don't make plans for the future, but to say now you have life. Now is the moment to live life. You find new opportunities. I found that I could find new opportunities by expanding my memory, by writing in my head, by composing, That was all that was open to me. If I'd have had books, if I'd have had papers, if I'd had access to the internet, gosh, life would have been completely full. It has been for me. It's been very full in the last months during lockdown. But even in those very limited circumstances, there are things that could be done and were done. Some people have said you're a person of faith. How did your faith help you in this situation? Well, I've never believed at all that if you claim to have faith, religious faith, you're going to be necessarily protected from the difficulties that face people in this world. All of us. We take our chance. We're all humans together. All I believe is that, what I believe is that it does give you a resource to draw on. I could say in the face of my captors, you have the power to break my body and you've tried, the power to bend my mind and you've tried, but my soul is not yours to possess. In other words, simple belief, my soul is not in the hands of other human beings to take control of, and you will not have it. You can't destroy me completely. A very, very simple belief, admittedly, but enough to give me hope. And there's the key. If in situations of extremity, extreme difficulty, you can maintain hope, then you are, in fact, 3 parts of the way home. I did face a mock execution. I was told I had 5 hours to live. I was taken into another room, blindfolded. I was afraid. Yes, I was afraid. For the first time in my life, my throat went dry through fear. I wasn't afraid of death as such. We're all going to die at some point. I didn't want to die at that point, obviously. But I was afraid of the very simple thing, will it hurt when they kill me? And how will they kill me? Will they shoot me? Will they behead me? What will happen? I asked for it. They said, do you want anything? So I asked for a drink. They gave me something to drink. So anything else? I said, yes. I'd like to write some letters to my family and friends. They said, you could write 1 letter. So looking beneath the blindfold, I wrote a composite letter. Said, anything else? I said, yes, I would like to say a prayer. They said, you can. So I said the Lord's Prayer out loud. Then they said, turn around. I turned around and I felt cold metal at my forehead. And then the gun was dropped. I presume it was a gun. It was dropped, and they said, another time. And that was the end of the interrogation after the end of 12 months. For the other 4 years, almost 4 years, I had no more torture, no more beatings, or no more execution or mock executions. I simply was left alone. Many things happened. I'm running to the end of time, so I've got to cut quickly now. But just one simple thing was this. I was allowed 1 visit to the bathroom each day. When I went into the bathroom, I only had a few minutes in there. Up high on the wall, there was a window which was normally padlocked with a wooden shutter. Remember, I was in an apartment building, 3 or 4 stories up. And on one day I went into that room and the window had been left unpadlocked. So I clambered up to see the first sight of the outside world for years. And as I looked down on the street below, I saw a lady carrying a bunch of flowers, full of colour. And it was the first time I'd seen colour in years. And I remember thinking to myself, goodness me, that very trite saying, it is trite, I know. But, the best things in life are free. And that made a big impression on me. And it's helped me realize, yes, all around us there are things that are free, that we have life, we have the environment which we should protect and care for. Learn to value it, learn to value life, learn to value your life and the life of other people and the life of this planet. Let your horizons be expanded in that way. And that can be done, and it can be done in all sorts of circumstances. Eventually I was released, And if you want to ask questions about that, you can. My time's up. I've been speaking for half an hour at least. So let me stop and pass over for any questions you have.
Thanks, Terry. And that was absolutely wonderful and fascinating. And I mean, just so much for us to engage with there. I think the question that I'd like to ask initially is it comes back to anger and about the embers of anger, which I think is such an important sort of a way of thinking about it. One of the things, and I know you're aware of this, Terry, but one of the challenges that we've had, in particular in Atlantic Canada, but across Canada, has been about I guess the way that the experience that we had in the pandemic in care homes in particular, and there's been significant social failures that, where we've failed as a society to protect our most vulnerable. What I think we'd love to hear from you is how would you suggest that as a community that we can come together to ensure that these events never happen again, regardless of the pandemic?
Well, I think that the pandemic has caused us all sorts of problems, and of course, in Canada there, you're not unique in facing that sort of difficulty. We've had our own difficulties here in the UK in care homes. I think what it means for us is this: that if we're just going to be angry and just going to let anger build up, that's not going to take us far. Yes, we can be critical, and we should be critical. Yes, we can say this has to change, but also we have to test ourselves, not just through words, but by actions, in showing our own personal care for those who are the most vulnerable in society. And that means building up community. There are some very good things that can happen as a result of lockdown and as a result of COVID. Some very good things. A renewed sense of community, a renewed sense that we have responsibility one for another, and not just leaving it to institutions or organizations, but we ourselves to be involved in that. And I think that is a way of approaching it. I can't speak in detail about the Halifax situation as I don't know it, but I can speak from my own experience here and to say how positive it can be if we take it in the right way.
Thanks, Terry. And just building on that, as you know, and we're seeing this in the UK in particular, it's this sense of connecting, and whether it's generations. So how do we get the young to be more to care more for the elderly? We're seeing it in a regional sense, and admittedly, this is more acute in the UK than certainly it is in Canada. But we're going through a terrible situation now in terms of a north-south divide. How do we help different communities learn to have empathy for each other and to care for each other?
Well, in this strange situation of lockdown, I have found in these last months, first of all, when in March, going back to March, I had many outside engagements, many speaking engagements, many engagements up and down the country and across the world. Overnight, they're gone. They were cancelled. Overnight. Okay, fine. So you say, well, there's nothing you can do about that. But what is possible now? Well, what was possible now was what the media we're using now. Now, I've been able in the last months to have personal conversations every week with people who have been, for example, who have been hostages. I founded an organization when I came out of captivity called Hostage International, Hostage UK, which gives support to families and support to released hostages. And we have lots of people working in that. But each week, I've been able to have 1 hour with different people, which is something I couldn't do before because I was constantly traveling, constantly moving. And that's been tremendously creative. So it is, all I'm saying is, that's one particular example. But it's possible through this medium, through the medium of the internet, to have that degree of contact and to make it warm, to make it human, to make it possible to have that exchange, even if you can't meet physically face to face. It's still possible. It may not be as good as face-to-face meeting, but it can be very valuable and can take us a long way. So again, we can build up a different type of community if we are limited, and that can be done by the elderly. And there's something to be said, for the elderly. I'm elderly. I'm 81. So I'm one of the old brigade, so to speak. And I'm still in contact with plenty of young people and plenty of others on the web.
That's wonderful. In your writing, Terry, you speak of your fears and reservations and hesitations about the use of technology. As a technologist, I'm really keen for us. Technology is supposed to be the gift that enables us as humans to achieve more than we could do on their own. But we know that there are challenges. What are you most concerned about with regards to the use of technology at present? And how do you feel that we can best move forward?
Well, but what concerns me most about it, in fact, is the fact that people can be and are, and some know to their detriment, really brutal. They can pass brutal comments and almost destroy people by some of the remarks they make. And there are certain people, fortunately they're in a minority, who take a perverse delight in doing that, in just knocking people down and destroying people. That, I think, is one of the big dangers. And I'm not sure how you deal with it other than to recognize it for what it is and to ignore it. That's all I can say. But it's very difficult to ignore. I mean, I remember at times in my past experience when I've been negotiating, I've come under some pretty fierce criticism from the media, not through the internet because it wasn't particularly active at the time I was involved, but through other media. And I know how it hurts. It definitely hurts. You can say you've got a thick skin, but everybody, I'm pretty sure feels it to a degree. So what I'm trying to say is, what I want to see is I want to build a soft society. I don't want us to become soft and sentimental. I don't want to stop us being able to challenge and challenge fairly. But what I do want to stop is brutality, cruelty, maliciousness, and that degree of unpleasantness that destroys people. And that is present not just on the web. It's present in society. It's there. And it's a side of life we have to deal with, and it's a side of life we have to deal with in ourselves. I mean, one of the recognitions that came to me in captivity was it wasn't the first time, but it came over very clearly, is that here was an opportunity, I said, to take an inner journey, to get to know yourself better. And if you get to know yourself better, you'll discover that you're a complex mixture of light and dark, of good and evil. It's in everybody. And it's no good being depressed about that. What we have to do is somehow try and work for that degree of inner wholeness, somehow be reconciled with ourselves. That scriptural saying, love your neighbor as yourself. And somehow we have to be able to learn to love ourselves in order to be able to love other people, not in a sentimental way, but in a realistic way.
No, absolutely. And I think there's so much about that in terms of respect and empathy, isn't there? And I think this is the sort of the consistent theme in what we're seeing is having respect for the situation of other people and empathy as well. I mean, it's a bit like we're seeing, and again, this is playing out probably more so in the UK than it is in Canada, but the whole issue about face masks and, face masks are really more about protecting the people around you rather than protecting yourself. And yet it's a very divisive thing in terms of how we think about that. Is there anything that you could offer on topics that divide us like that? So whether we should wear face masks or not, is there something that we can do to sort of unite ourselves to try and, come to some common understanding?
Well, I just on the question of face masks, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there are a number of people who are just saying, well, I don't like the things, and what's the point of it? The point of it is, as you quite rightly said, is largely for protection of other people. And that I think is particularly important. There is a degree of selfishness in this country. Some people saying exactly what you've just said, the same as probably being said in Canada. What can we do? Well, it's a matter of growing up within ourselves. I mean, one of the things that happened to me in captivity was this. I experienced um, a certain amount of suffering. Many people have suffered far more than I have. But I mean, there was a certain degree of suffering entailed in being in that situation which I've described. Um, and when I came out, I realized this, that there was a big difference between sympathy and empathy. Sympathy means that you feel sorry for somebody. Oh, there are those poor old people, the poor families, and they're right to feel sorry for them, who are suffering as a result of the loss of their relatives in a care home. Sympathy. Empathy is to know what it feels like to experience that loss. And I know what it feels like now to experience loss, to experience loneliness. And it's different than sympathy. And therefore, suffering, we'll all experience it. Everybody in the world experiences suffering to a greater or lesser degree. Life is not fair. Some people suffer more than others. But I can say one thing with absolute certainty, that in the majority of cases, suffering need not destroy. Something creative can emerge from it. And that was a message I would say to, people in Canada in that terrible situation. Very dreadful, of course, and it's understandable that you're angry, but don't let the suffering destroy you. Let the suffering turn to empathy, and let that empathy be then translated into forms of action which are creative.
Terry, I want to ask you two questions, and they're both big questions, and so I don't want to lose sight of them by putting them together. But just hearing you talk about the importance of empathy, do you think there's more that we should be doing in society to teach empathy? So especially when it comes to our kids in particular, and teaching them empathy as they grow up. That's the first question. And the second question speaks very much to what you were just talking about, the sort of the suffering and the anger situations that have happened to us. And I want to talk to you about sort of reconciliation and healing. How do you move from anger to sort of a place of reconciliation? So the first question is about empathy, and do we need to teach that in our society? And the second is, talk to us about how you convert that anger into something that becomes, moves towards healing and reconciliation in a society and a community.
Well, the first one on empathy. I mean, it's an enormous subject you asked, but it's just to give one example, one instance. I think we should check ourselves to say, when we're talking about other people, to look at the possibly negative stereotypes of other people, negative stereotypes of the. I'm afraid. Have you lost me now?
No, we're still there, Terry. You're still fine.
Oh, I beg your pardon. Sorry, I thought you'd lost me. We have negative stereotypes of people from other backgrounds, other races, other religions. There's a very strong negative stereotype of some people from the Islamic faith. Well, the way to get round that is to get to know people, to get to talk to people, to get to understand people, not just to allow people to be wrapped up in their own ghetto. In other words, you begin to teach empathy by bringing people together from different backgrounds, getting to understand each other. That is a way in which we can work, and recognizing negative stereotypes for what they are. They are negative stereotypes. Recognize them and get behind them to the person. And when you do that, as I was able to do that to a degree with Revolutionary Guards in Iran, see them as human beings, see them as people. Don't always agree. You don't always have to agree with what people do. You can disagree with what they do, but you can still understand them as a person. And I think that's something we should be doing. And that is the way That is the way to reconciliation. The way to reconciliation is this: to try and understand why people are behaving as they're behaving, to try and get to that point. Why is it you're doing what you're doing, which is causing so much division? What is it that's motivating you? What are your grudges? Try and understand. You don't have to agree, but you can if you can understand, you can begin to find ways of building bridges.
As a result of that, Terry, are you able to rationalize what happened to you? Are you able to find peace with that?
Oh yeah, I don't have it. I mean, I let myself in for it, and I looking back on it. I mean, obviously, I wouldn't want to go through that experience again. Of course, I wouldn't. Would I do what I did? Would I do what I did again? I hope I would stand by the principle, and the principle is, you as best you. Let me preface this by saying, I am no saint. I mean, I haven't always behaved in the most honourable way in life. I certainly haven't, and I'm not claiming that for one. But there comes a time in life when sometimes you say, I really must do what I know is right and what I believe to be right. And you do it. You get on. And I would say, looking back, in principle, I'd hope I'd have the courage to do what I did, to follow that principle of not letting people down at a time when they're in extreme need, and saying I'm going to do everything I can, even if it's going to cost me everything. I hope I would still have that within me to do that. I don't know if I would or not, but I hope I would.
That's great. Thanks, Terry. I'd love to talk to you a bit about your spirituality as well, really. And, you know, did you find, I know you mentioned it in your talk, and you sort of were quite careful about how you define spirituality, I felt. Did that help you? You know, your definition of spirituality, did that help you in captivity? And then also sort of building on that, do you think there's an absence of spiritual understanding in people today? And do you think that's, you know, probably making things worse for us in terms with coping with the isolation from the pandemic?
Well, I think people are certainly concerned about spirituality. A lot of people are fed up with religion. If I could make a difference between the two. You know, the religious attitudes where everything is, you know, you just follow the rule and you're within a tight constraint and so on. You know what I mean by that.
Yeah.
But I think that doesn't mean to say that people are not, don't have spiritual desire within them. I think they do. I put it this way, and you may want to call me a heretic for this, but let me just say what I feel. I think that life really, if you really look at it, is a great mystery. We really, it's full of mystery. Why are we here? What happens to us when we die? I mean, I contemplate that now, you know. When you get to 81, you say, well, there are not many more years left, you know. Where am I going? What's going to happen after that? We don't know. People will tell us that this is going to happen, but nobody knows for absolute certain. They say it all rests on faith. And so life is really a mystery. And part of the journey of life, as I understand it, is this, is to grow more deeply to the mystery, towards the mystery that lies within and beyond us. And that doesn't mean knowing all the answers. It means but trying to explore that. And this is where religion can help, because some of the framework of religion can be an aid to this. But religion and the framework, that is not the end in itself. And some people make, you know, the keeping of the regulation, the keeping of the framework, to be the end in itself. The end in itself is beyond that, and spirituality lies beyond that. So I would put it that, you know, the framework is but a means to enable us to proceed towards a deeper understanding of that mystery which is of God and which lies within us.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Terry. So look, my final question for you, we're living in a world that has some pretty significant challenges in front of us. One of them is about the environment, and David Attenborough has clearly given us all a challenge to make a few small adjustments to our lives to save the planet as we approach what is essentially a critical tipping point. But as we go into winter now, and I think these are going to be probably the most difficult months that many will have seen for a generation, what's the one thing that you think we should all be doing to make those sort of dark days ahead of us a little better for everybody? What's the one small thing that everybody could do that would make the biggest difference in how we progress through this next phase of the pandemic?
That's a very big question, and I'm not sure the one thing we could do. I think, first of all, not be depressed by it. Recognize that it's an opportunity, and seek that opportunity, those opportunities that are there for us. They will be different for us in different circumstances. But recognize this is an opportunity now to grow and to explore in new directions that we haven't taken before. And when it comes back to the environment, I feel passionately about that. I feel we are being, so many things are taking place now which are just destroying this beautiful world of ours. And I would say definitely be concerned about the environment and show that concern in active ways. But to come back to your one point, take now as an opportunity, take this winter as an opportunity, and many creative things can happen for you if you let them and look for them.
Thank you, Terry. That's been absolutely wonderful and enlightening to hear from you this afternoon. One of the things that I find incredibly frustrating about these online events is it's so difficult for us all to share our appreciation, not just for your time, but for your thought and for your words. And so I know all of the audience joining us on the Zoom call in Canada, but also more broadly around the world on the live stream, would all like to pass on our thanks for giving us this time. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Terry Waite. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, thanks, and goodbye, everybody, and all the very best. And thanks for allowing me to share with you today. It's been a great privilege. Bye-bye.
So thank you so much, everybody, for giving us your time this afternoon or this morning or this evening, wherever you are in the world. If you're on the Zoom call and you're heading now into the breakout sessions, I've got a few pieces of information that will be helpful to you. There's a few instructions as you prepare to go into discussions on Zoom. We won't formally hear from you again through this channel, but if you would love to share some feedback, we'd love to hear from you. And if you could share that feedback via email to spatalks@dal.ca. When you're in your virtual breakout room, please introduce yourself and briefly highlight as part of your introduction any questions that you wished that Terry might have addressed. And then in your group, it would be great if you could jointly agree a chairperson to moderate the talk. Please also consider asking a group or member to email any reflections on the two questions that I'm going to get to in a second, or any other matters that your group would like to hear talks on. And again, if possible, it'd be great to get those collected and sent on to that email address. I'll give you that again, which is spatalks@dal.ca. So the two questions that we'd basically put on the table to stimulate the roundtable discussion and help us develop future talks are: what's the question that you would have liked to ask Terry, and why would you have liked to ask it? And then the second question, we'd love to hear about what were the key takeaways for you from Terry's talk, or matters that you'd like to share with others, and why? Finally, once again, thank you so much for taking time to give Dalhousie University, through the Shaw Lecture and the Warren Series discussion, the opportunity to assist with a worldwide conversation on COVID-19, isolation, loneliness, and social change. Segelberg Trust thanks Terry Waite graciously for sharing his insights and addressing the challenges the pandemic presents for most vulnerable populations in your communities and around the planet. And the trustees would also like to thank everybody who worked so hard to make this all happen. This was a partnership spanning the Atlantic and involving several operating units as Dalhousie. Thank you so much to you all. Thank you so much for joining us. My name's Dave Coplin, and we hope you have a great rest of the day. Thank you.